months.
Take a deep breath. Center yourself.
Send my foot up that error's ass.
Do your yoga meditation. It will help.
Why do you think? Because I'm from California, you think I do yoga?
What would Asatar Bear do?
Slap the shit out of somebody.
No, Astar Bear's a teddy bear.
He's got big hands, man. He's been known to slap a motherfucker that gets out of pocket.
Watch your language, Jason Miles. That is champagne room talk.
Well, let's go. Let's go. We got the Ayatollah on the screen. Let's go. Good evening, everyone. I'm your host, Jason Miles, and welcome to another episode of This is Revolution Podcast. Before we start, if you're new to the channel, please hit subscribe and don't forget to hit that notification bell so you are alerted whenever we go live. We're constantly adding cross streams to other channels and adding new shows. Speaking of new shows, the white guys are back, and you know they can never be white. The white guys are back. I don't think he saw me freestyling a Fat Boys song on today's show. But White Guy Wednesday in some iteration will be back tomorrow. Anything that isn't me and Toussaint we just have to call it White Guy Wednesday. Unless it's Djene doing a solo pre-record, then that's Djene doing a solo pre-record. But if it's Djene plus another one of the White Guy Wednesday crew, then it's just a White Guy Wednesday show. I have intel on them, and they've been trying to commandeer other days during the week. White people are too much. They're trying to colonize my channel. If you're enjoying what we do here and would like access to our post-show champagne room, there's only one way. Become a patron for as little as $3 a month and $30 for the year. It can all be yours. Also, we'll be doing a champagne room tonight with Djene Bajlan, and we're going to turn the phone lines on. Not sure yet. Don't know how you guys are going to feel about this, but if you guys are very animated about this discussion, then of course we're going to turn the phone lines on. Of course, we want to hear what you have to say. And I think this is a subject that people will probably have a lot to talk about. That being said, let's bring in my show producer, my right-hand woman, the person that keeps me centered, as you guys heard. Please welcome the faceless voice of reason, M. Toussaint.
Hello, young Jason. How's your blood pressure?
It's on a steady rise. I've been running around like an old man fussing all day.
Puffy white clouds.
I had to get me and Ben went to lunch today because the weather has been gorgeous, and I had to get him home in time to get to Katie Halper. He was on Katie Halper, and scheduling is very interesting with Katie.
Mm.
So we had to get him home in time. But like the whole time trying to drive there, just heard Austin Powers music in my head. Dun, 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 dun.
Okay.
Trying to watch out for potholes and fucking pedestrians rushing. Just stressful day, Toussaint, as you know. And then Djene Bajlan decided to send us his article in the craziest format of all time.
It was Phil Spector's wall of text.
He was so mad that he was like, "This is what you get," and I felt like he sent that to us with a middle finger in the sky, like Eminem. No more rap music for Djene Bajlan. This is what happens when he plays too much rap music.
But Djene is having a good day, and this is part of his good day.
I wish we could have done this sooner to the time when it came out, and Djene, you don't have any say-so on when this stuff comes out. So he sadly was gone on a speaking at a conference.
No.
Yeah, he was.
It was a holiday.
He was speaking at a conference. Don't make it sound like Djene is rich. Someone on Twitter already said Djene Bajlan was rich.
That's funny. Rich and friends.
You know what? It's my new favorite thing now to have people call other people they don't know rich. Like, but you don't know anything about him. I think he's as rich as you want him to be. I mean, them t-shirts, them Marvel tees, them some Walmart tees. Them ain't comic book store grade. That's I'm gonna just get one thing for myself. Chasing around two badass kids in Walmart.
A little dad treat.
Just one treat. I just gotta get a Spider-Man tee. I just get one Spider-Man tee. I know that pain. It's dad pain. Only real dad knows that pain. Well, look, let's get Djene on the screen. Sadly, in the world in which we exist online, the term anti-imperialist has become a signifier that you are a serious follower of geopolitics from a left perspective. But in its present iteration, what does it really mean? Are you anti-empire or just anti-American empire? If you see the US as the ultimate evil, the reason behind every war or disaster globally, then have you just internalized what our guest calls an inverted American exceptionalism? From his recent piece in Compact Magazine. Yet too often lately, anti-imperialism has become merely the mirror image of the worldview of the foreign policy establishment. Much like their neoconservative or liberal internationalist opponents, today's anti-imperialists hold fast to American exceptionalism. Only for the anti-imperialists, it is an inverted exceptionalism that casts the United States as an irredeemable villain, a uniquely evil force upon the world stage. Meanwhile, America's foes are treated as misunderstood and maligned victims of Western propaganda. In maintaining this Manchian moral binary, the anti-imperialists inadvertently reaffirm the basis upon which neoconservatives and liberal internationalists seek to exercise imperial power. To critique this inverted American exceptionalism, one needn't assume American good intentions in every case. Nor should we meet the accusations leveled by American foreign policy elites or their acolytes in the press against this or that regime with credulity. I can't say it.
Credulity.
That's what I meant to say.
Yeah. It's okay. It'll be fine.
The masters of the American empire can lie, and they do. But what about the cases where the neocon accusations are, in fact, true? What if, in other words, the imperialists aren't lying? That was written by my good friend and part of the TIR crew. Please welcome everyone's favorite history professor at Missouri State University, Mean Djene Bajlan.
What's up, MT? What's up, Jason? Good to be here with you guys today.
Can you say credulity 3 times fast?
Credulity, credulity, credulity. I feel before we begin, I do have to respond to some of the accusations that were made towards me by you beforehand. We are definitely not trying to colonize colonize TIR. We reject that notion. To the people who think that I'm wealthy, I want to assure you, no white people are paid in the making of This Is Revolution. This is a general rule that we have, that white people don't get money. We work for free. This is our reparations.
Reparations, yeah.
To MT and Jason, we put our time. And to the people who think that my large Warhammer collection proves that I'm rich, I will say two things. One thing, I used to work for Games Workshop, so I have tons of miniatures I got super cheap. And B, I get my miniatures from the flea market, where people don't know the value of their Warhammer models and sell them for really cheap. So,
Djene's like Johnny Depp in that movie, The Ninth Gate.
I haven't seen that for ages.
That's you. It's a Roman Polanski movie.
Oh, it's a Roman Polanski movie.
Oh, yeah. It was not.
Well, somebody claimed that they knew my salary online, which is kind of funny because you can actually look up my salary. It's not that amazing. It's pretty okay, but it's definitely not what people think professors are getting. It's like, how much do you think we get? Certainly history professors don't get that much. I think the business and the law professors drag the average up.
I think they thought you were the head football coach of Missouri University.
Yeah. Now, apparently, that's the best job you can get at a U.S. university.
Oh, I mean, there's a piece that came out a while back where they showed like the highest paid state employees were sports coaches.
Mm-hmm. It is it's an issue. It's an issue. People think that college sports make money, but for most schools, they just don't make money. They're a loss, and they can sometimes cost universities a lot of money. There's only a few schools that are raking in the dollars from college sports.
And you teach at a Division II school. I mean, we could do a whole show about that, but you're at a smaller school. They're trying to get to be a Division I. There's a whole process in which these schools they try, and it takes. You can't just like wake up one day and become a Division I university. Like there's a process to it. It's very difficult. But enough with that. Let's talk more about.
Let's talk more about Djene being on food stamps. Djene's on WIC, trying to feed his kids. Don't judge.
These kids are expensive. These kids are expensive.
He wasn't at Crystal Ball's wedding, so he's not wealthy.
Oh.
No.
Only the people at Crystal Ball's wedding are wealthy.
Okay.
Yeah. Now you know.
Now you know.
That's what the internet told me.
Well, the internet was very worried about Crystal Ball having an association with Marianne Williamson. And all I could say was like, well, she's called Crystal Ball. It seems Marianne Williamson would be the most appropriate person to have at that wedding. I mean, it's very on brand.
Crystal Mommy.
Do people really think that she's a Washington power broker, that Marianne Williamson?
She's a fixer.
The fixer? With those fucking long flowing hemp pants.
What's going on with this potty mouth, Jason Miles?
What did I say?
You said the F word. You're teaching children the F word.
Djene Bajlan, you walk around like a dirt smudged face chimney sweep, cursing at everybody in your home.
I do. That's just lies.
He gets more British. By the end of the show, he'll have one of those Sherlock Holmes hats and a pipe.
Well, he refreshed his accent when he went back. He was in danger of sounding American.
Well,
they were teasing him. His brothers were teasing him.
They were saying I sound American, yes, which is
horrible.
It is what it is. It is what it is. I sound like Nathan Robinson now.
Were you on air when you said your son was going to grow up to sound like Nathan Robinson? That's I almost fell out of my chair when you said.
So long as he doesn't grow up to dress like Nathan Robinson, I'm fine.
And was it you that called him the Plantation Riddler?
No, I can't take credit for that. That's
You had to clear the sample.
no, that was someone else online.
Nathan
okay.
seems like a fine chap.
He does. He's a perfectly fine chap. He just dresses like a Southern gentleman.
Okay. On British holiday? In an Austin Powers film?
As long as
Maybe.
he doesn't burn. Gotta have a
Maybe.
parasol.
Maybe.
Nate Robinson and Pascal with parasols. Walking along the French Quarter. I declare.
I do declare.
Djene, we're going to get serious here because you wrote a serious paper and you've been talking about this paper for a long time.
Yeah.
Can you first explain your theory of inverted American exceptionalism? And also, where do you think this inverted version of it comes from?
Yeah. So, the background to the piece, which is called The Poverty of Anti-Imperialism, was kind of a therapy piece for me to a certain degree. It was an attempt to try and get my thoughts in order on the question of anti-imperialism, of American empire, and it's a response to the way that I think some, not all, on the left look at the question of American empire. And my hypothesis that I wanted to put forward is that, a lot of anti-imperialism, or at least certain elements of the left, have a tendency, and I would say it's an understandable tendency, given the horrors of American empire, to view the question of anti-imperialism in terms of a conflict between an American empire, America and its subordinate allies in the West, versus the global South, right?
Mhm.
And this is a legitimate way to look at things, but I think sometimes what ends up happening is, in opposing American imperialism, there is a credulity directed about the motivations and the nature of those countries that are victims of American imperialism. There is sometimes a romanticization of those who are fighting American imperialism or who are in conflict with the United States, which can lead people to how might I put it, to basically end up in this debate in which anything that we hear from the United States or from the American media establishment, we assume is a lie, right? And the opposing narrative is the truth.
What's an example?
Okay, so for example, we might have people who, rightfully critique American policy towards the Middle East, towards Iran, towards Syria, and that's perfectly legitimate. But I think there are some tendencies on the left that go beyond that into glorifying the regimes that are in conflict with the United States, and regimes that are sometimes quite right wing in their political orientation, like the Islamic Republic of Iran and also Assad's Syria. I have, for leftists, for example, who quote unquote stand for China or for, formerly communist regimes, I have more sympathy because at least in that, context, there is a kind of adherence to there's a socialist country that we should defend, etc. But we see a type of anti-imperialism, particularly in the West, that just tends to look at any state that is opposing the United States as being engaged in a heroic anti-imperialist struggle. And the byproduct of that is often that people view developments in the global south through a very simplified lens, one where it's America versus. That, for example, protests in a country like Iran, they're are assumed to be some kind of CIA plot, right? That, and I think there's a kind of what ends up happening is, people are debating on the veracity of particular accusations leveled against a regime. Some people in opposing American imperialism will, for example, downplay human rights abuses that are taking place in a particular country. They will try and reduce any protests that are in that country to being a foreign plot, rather than the product of particular dynamics that are taking place in that country. For example, as I mentioned, the protests recently in Iran. There was a lot of sympathy on the left for the protests in Iran, but there were elements on the left that also just immediately assumed that because this was a protest movement against a government that is at odds with the United States, that somehow this was being provoked by the United States. Now, of course, that's not to say that, the Americans or any other country doesn't try to take advantage of discord in their opponents, their enemies internationally. But I think it's a very reductive view to try and to assume priori that any protests taking place in those countries that oppose the United States are somehow cooked up by the boys in Langley. It's all a conspiracy. And the reason I wanted to make this argument was that I think by adopting that kind of view, we, in a certain way, we're kind of making it easy on each other, easy on ourselves, because we can portray, we invert the moral calculus, like whereas the liberal internationalists or the neocons will argue that America has the right to intervene, and especially liberal interventionists talk about the right to protect, and they will obviously use human rights abuses or things. They'll exaggerate them, sometimes fabricate things to enact their policies, right? But it's not always a case of fabrication, right? When building the case for the war in Iraq, obviously we all know that there was extremely misleading information out there, but the Americans also said things that were true, that Saddam Hussein had used poison gas against Iran, against the Kurdish population. That wasn't a lie. The issue is not whether a particular accusation is true or not, but rather what's the agenda being put forward to that. So we can accept, for example, evidence showing that a country opposed to the United States might be doing all kinds of very negative things, right? Without arguing, we can accept that and at the same time oppose imperialism. In fact, what I would argue is that by arguing over the veracity of human rights claims or the justifications that the United States is putting forward to, whether it's to protect people in Libya or to bring democracy to Iraq or to protect human rights, we can treat that with a kind of cynicism, but we perhaps don't need to endlessly debate over the veracity of particular claims of human rights abuses and not, because that is ultimately, if we're opposing empire, a secondary order issue.
Well, let's talk about that real quick. You do mention China in your piece, and you do mention Uyghurs, not by name. And while there's some people that have been to, is it Xinjiang? Am I saying it right?
Xinjiang, yeah.
On quote diplomatic missions, so it's a little different when you go somewhere diplomatically than just popping on in willy-nilly and seeing how things operate. It's almost like when the district manager comes to your store.
Yeah, I mean that's a good example of what I'm talking about. So I'm not going to pretend I have any specialist knowledge on the situation of the Uyghurs, obviously I've read the news reports, I've read, the responses from China and pro-China people. And, obviously, I know for a fact, for example, there was some, misinformation circulating about what was going on in China. I saw for example, there was a picture going around on Turkish social media of an Asian person with a boot on their face. And they were like, this is what they're doing to people in Xinjiang. And it turned out that picture was actually from Thailand. And, so obviously there is misinformation. I'm not in a position to judge the veracity of all these claims. And so we see a big debate taking place over, whether the Chinese are abusing the Uyghurs or whether everything's actually just okay and it's all just Western propaganda. And my point would be it's actually a second order issue over, as someone who lives in America, it's really a distraction to try and debate over what's happening with the Uyghurs at the moment. Don't get me wrong, it's important to try and ascertain the truth of the situation to the best of our ability, but the political implications from my perspective of whether this was like the worst case scenario and the Uyghurs were suffering a genocide, whether that was true or whether this was all just an American lie. For us in America, the political implications would be the same as people on the left. We would still want to oppose any escalation with China, because any escalation with China, let's say that's justified on the grounds of the abuses of the Uyghurs, will have very dangerous implications. At best, if you have sanctions, that'll lead to economic hardship of millions of people across the world. And if it comes to war, I mean, we're doomed. It's a nuclear war. So my point isn't to say that we shouldn't try and find out the truth of accusations. I'm raising the question that, well, sometimes the statements of the US are, factual, right? They may be deployed cynically or misleadingly, but they might actually be factual. And we should avoid getting stuck on the ground, stuck on a level of debate where we're debating the veracity of particular justifications and have a kind of dogmatic opposition to American militarism, whether it is quote unquote justifiable on humanitarian grounds or not. That is a second order issue, because every deployment of American military power, whether justifiable or not, enhances the position of the American war machine, entrenches it further in American society, and globally reinforces an institution that maybe in some specific cases may alleviate some immediate suffering, but overall, in the big picture, is extremely destructive on every single level. So my argument was that we actually don't need to create a moral binary. We don't need to debate anti-imperialism in moral terms, and at least in terms of trying to find good guys and bad guys. But rather, we should, as people in the United States or in the West, should be opposing our war machine.
But Djene, I'm sorry to cut you off, but I think that's really important. And I want to bring up a show you did a few weeks ago about Syria.
Right.
That show did not do great numbers. And I don't think it was because you or the guest was uninformed about the topic. I don't think it was because you guys drug on too long or made too many silly jokes. It was a very serious show. You guys got right to the point, talked about it. But I think Syria is a very difficult issue for a lot of people because there's a lot of hands involved. And to your point about good guy, bad guy narratives, do you believe, and you can expand on Syria, of course, that in situations like Syria, for example, it's hard for people to really understand what's going on because they're just trying to find the easiest, most concise way to root for a side?
Yeah, I mean, I think people are desperate to, find a good guy, bad guy narrative. I think that makes things. It makes your political position, easier to swallow, right? It helps you sleep at night, right?
Mhm.
So, for example, in the Ukraine war, we have, a portion of the quote unquote left that is rallying to the support of Ukraine, that talks about Ukraine's right of national self-determination, Russian imperialism, etc. And then we have a section of the left that is certainly a minority in the grand scheme of things, but is arguing that no, actually, Russia are the good guys in this conflict. And, quite ironically, many leftists are quoting Mersheimer, a right-wing realist, to make their case that actually, Russia is not at all responsible for this. This is entirely an American, project designed to weaken
NATO.
It's NATO. Now, of course, the United States, and in fact, all sides in this conflict have bear some kind of responsibility, either directly or indirectly. But when I look at this conflict, I see, it's like not a easy good versus evil. It's not an easy a good versus evil conflict, right? There are very unsavory groups on both sides of this conflict, and I think we can oppose the American war machine and say that, whatever the cases of this war is, whatever the causes, whatever the outcome, American military intervention will have a negative effect. Or even if you think that, well, it's a righteous use of American force, it will, in the long term, only serve as a vehicle to entrench the military industrial complex further in the United States. So, there's a kind of there's a problem there, right? There's like a fundamental deep problem, and I think our opposition to imperialism should be not rooted necessarily in quote unquote support for the other side in a conflict, right? Running apologetics for Assad or running apologetics for Iran. We don't need to do that to oppose it, right? We should, in fact, oppose it dogmatically based on the idea that we, as people in the United States, have to oppose the American military industrial complex. The military industrial complex is ultimately, it's not an evil cabal of people, being, laughing about like killing people in Afghanistan. It's a impersonal, amoral, and, a set of institutions that have their own impetus behind them. And every time that military power is used, that complex of people who have material interests in keeping the war machine alive and keeping the empire alive for their own very immediate material interests, they're further entrenched in American society, and they, suck up resources from people in the United States and cause untold amounts of violence and death around the world in a general sense. And, we might think of it like this. I think most people would say American participation in the Second World War against Nazism was a positive thing, right? But it is illustrative of the kind of danger of the use of American military power, even in a case where we would think that it's like a positive use. Because what was the legacy of the Second World War? Well, it was the militarization of the United States. The war against Nazism created the infrastructure of this all-powerful military industrial complex, so much so that President Eisenhower, in fact, warned against it during the early stages of the Cold War, about how this institution was sucking up resources in American society, how it was a theft from people. So my point is that rather than opposing imperialism in this kind of moral binary way, where America is the bad guy and whoever's fighting America is the good guy, and I don't want to say everybody on the left does this, but there is a tendency on the left to do this, or that some people on the left feel the need to run, interference on issues that they perhaps don't have that much information on and make declarative statements on it.
Well,
I think,
again, back to the Syria point. I haven't heard too many people, either you're an Assad, I don't even want to say apologist, fan. I've seen some people say that he's a socialist president or leader of that country. I don't necessarily agree with that. But
well,
go ahead.
Arab socialist. That's a different thing.
Oh, well.
Baathism, which was a right-wing political movement that was used to suppress the left in especially in the 50s and 60s. It was a statist political ideology, but it was nationalist and right-wing, and Syria had a lot of internal dynamics that drove that civil war. Of course, the United States and the interference of the United States, as well as other countries in the region, have exacerbated the conflict, sustained the conflict as well. But this is not a case of a country, quote unquote, that is fighting the United States per se. It's like a many-sided conflict, and it's pretty complicated situation. And to reduce it to a conflict between the United States and the Syrian nation and Syrian people is to belie the kind of complexities that exist in Syrian society. The regional actors that are very important in determining the flow of events in Syria, countries like Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Iran, all of which have some kind of autonomy of action. Also, like I said, the internal dynamics within the country. People didn't rise up in Syria because a bunch of CIA agents told them to. There were material issues in that country related to climate change, drought, sectarianism, all these kind of issues which have deep historical roots, and then just can't just be reduced to the question of American empire, but rather is linked to a global system of imperialism, a global system of capitalism, which has shaped the modern world, which doesn't have which isn't just a product of the United States.
Well, I'm interested in where you think this is coming from. We do have a super chat where Ron M asks,
thank you, Ron,
something along the lines of what I'd like to know. What is the root cause of this cynicism?
Well, I think the root cause is a very justifiable one. People have been lied to or misled at the very best, by the American foreign policy establishment. We find out often that the justifications for something were at best exaggerated or more complex than they were being portrayed, or at worst, outright falsification. I think people, especially in the age of social media and the age of 24-hour cable television, are more familiar with like the costs of American empire and world, like the humanitarian costs. We see pictures of what happens in these countries, right? We see videos, the control, the flow of information. And I think people are rightfully very cynical about American empire, especially many of those who have been brought up in a culture which, views America in a far less critical way, that sees America as the, bastion of democracy, that America is the indispensable nation. I think people react against that kind of discourse, but in reacting against it, they just invert it. That is to say, instead of America being like the morally right nation that even if it makes mistakes, it's trying to do its best, instead of that, there's a kind of notion that it is a uniquely bad nation. But my argument would be is that the cost of American empire is not something innate to the American nation, some ineffable part of American culture, that America is somehow a sui generously evil state. The American empire is costly because it's the biggest empire in the world, right? If another capitalist state, let's say Britain or Brazil or I don't know, think of a country, think of a capitalist country. If that country had a similar economic footprint and military footprint, I suspect that it would behave quite similarly, right? So my point is that we actually need to reject the moral binary of anti, of this version of anti-imperialism, this inverted American exceptionalism. And the reason we should do it is because I think if many of those who hold these views, number one, they end up in a kind of conspiratorial version of understanding politics, where everything is an American conspiracy. Every protest is a color revolution in the making, et cetera, et cetera. And often they take the statements of countries being accused of misdeeds at face value. And I think we should move away from that kind of that basis for opposition to one that says, actually, it doesn't really matter what is going on in these countries, right? Whether there really are human rights abuses or whether it's all fabricated, right? The question for us in the West is not running interference or for an indefensible regime like the Islamic Republic of Iran, but to focus on ourselves and say, whatever the merits of a case for intervention that the liberals are putting forward, for us on the left, that is actually irrelevant, because we don't want to appeal to the capitalist state, to the imperialist state, to do these kind of things. And that's difficult because there are people who might actually really be saved by some kind of intervention.
Give us an example of somewhere that actually would benefit from.
Well, I'll give you a very concrete example. Like in the aftermath of the Gulf War, the first Gulf War in 1991, as people might remember, there were popular uprisings against Saddam Hussein, one in the Kurdish north of the country and one in the Shia south of the country. Now, the north of the country was protected by a UN no-fly zone. There was a lot of talk about doing a humanitarian intervention, although there were like geostrategic reasons why that intervention took place, mainly because Turkey didn't want to see a large inflow of Kurdish refugees from Iraq into Turkey, which could have been a big problem for the country. So there was an intervention, and Saddam Hussein was basically not allowed to return to the Kurdish region, and the Kurdish population was spared a kind of massacre at the hands of the regime. In the south, the Shias also rose up, but they were not protected, and there was an enormous human toll on the Shia population. So, that's a very clear case where you see, in a very limited sense, that the American intervention was quote unquote successful, right? At least in saving lives. But a lot of the times we'll end up just debating forever whether or not a particular intervention made things worse or not. Like with Gaddafi, obviously Libya is a mess today. Would it be a mess had the Americans not intervened? I don't know, but it's really, in my opinion, irrelevant. But another way,
how do you feel about the narrative about Gaddafi as far as him being this kind of liberator, and he's going to bring the African continent together under one rule? And
well, I find it very funny because after the Iraq War, Gaddafi actually made peace with the West. He was hiring people like Tony Blair, David Held, an academic, bringing them in, talking about all kinds of stuff about how great Libya was. Gaddafi, in fact, participated in the rendition of people during the War on Terror. He was like a War on Terror ally during this period, right? Yeah, he did a lot of this kind of discourse about like Pan-African unity. He was a bit of an
coin.
Yeah, exactly. He was, Libya had a lot of money from the oil and gas industry, so obviously some people benefited from that. But also like Gaddafi was a kind of a dictator, and one who remained in office who used, all kinds of brutalities towards his opponents, who completely decimated any semblance of civil society that might have emerged in Libya. So, obviously, it was very convenient for everyone to discover in 2011 that Gaddafi was a bad dude. But, previously they'd totally been more than happy to take his money or work with him. So, Gaddafi is a good example, right, of suddenly someone who gets, deified because they get taken down by the Americans, even though at some point those guys were, Gaddafi was perfectly fine with the West. Saddam Hussein's another good example. Saddam Hussein presented as a hero of anti-imperialism, the fact that the Ba'ath Party,
took out the communists.
Took out the communists. In fact, were assisted by the CIA in taking out the
64, 65?
In the 1963 coup. There was a revolution in
Qasim.
There was a revolution in 1958. A military officer, Abdul Karim Qasim, took over. He was seen by the West as being too pro-Soviet, and there was a coup in which the Ba'ath Party were kind of junior partners because they kind of got purged after the coup initially, but they did a lot of the dirty work, killing communists and socialists, and doing so with the assistance of the CIA. And of course, during the 1980s, Saddam Hussein was getting backing from both the United States and the Soviet Union, and France and other countries to fight Iran. But to a certain degree, at least in some elements of the West, Saddam Hussein has been rehabilitated because in the end he went down fighting the United States. So my point is that endlessly debating the virtues of a particular regime that opposes the United States misses the woods for the trees. Like, if we want to oppose empire, we should just oppose it on the basis of empire, opposing empire at home, and opposing the military-industrial complex, even if there are a minority of cases where you could make a humanitarian case for intervention. And we should avoid that temptation and have this dogmatic opposition. But it's a difficult one to maintain, because if you suddenly start thinking, well, some of these people fighting in Iran, calling out for help, if they're not just stooges of imperialism but have legitimate reasons, then leaving to them to their fate, when at least theoretically US power could assist them, leaving to their fate becomes a very uncomfortable prospect, right? Because you're sitting here comfortably, safe, secure, and these people are protesting in Iran, for example. It becomes difficult because you accept the validity of their anger and their protest, but continue to say we still shouldn't intervene because the costs in a grand scheme of things are just too high. It's just too high. We should be focused on opposing this military-industrial complex. So it becomes more difficult. It's very easy when you just say, like, well, anyone who's calling for US support is a stooge of imperialism and a dupe and a CIA asset. It becomes easy to, cheer on their destruction. But if you recognize that, maybe there's like legitimate reasons for this, but we still shouldn't do something, that's like, it's difficult, right? I opposed the Iraq War when the Iraq War happened. That was personally difficult for me because, most Kurdish people in Iraq supported the overthrow of Saddam Hussein. And why wouldn't they, right? Saddam Hussein barbarized the region with the support of the West. People knew that the United States wasn't a reliable ally. It's not like they were taken into it, but a lot of people rallied behind it because they were like, well, our enemy, the enemy of our enemy is our friend, right? And, that's the kind of tragedy that we deal with. It's just very easy to condemn people protesting around the world, hoping for some kind of intervention to protect them. It's very easy to condemn them if you think they're just stooges of imperialism. But if you take a more complex view and see that America is not the only agency in the world, it's not the only thing directing things, and at times, it's in fact not directing things at all, it's a second order player, then we have like a more complicated picture, but one that's actually more difficult to it's more difficult. It's a difficult one, right?
As you bring that up, this reminds me of something that we used to talk about kind of more than most on this show, the Afghanistan papers, which was, kind of the wool being pulled over these quote anti-imperialist eyes, maybe before they were out in full force like they are now. Basically saying that America is an extremely inept, bumbling empire that didn't really know what they were doing in the Middle East.
I think when we look at American empire, it's important to look at it not as a unified whole, but as a collection of institutions and cabals and businesses and think tanks. There is not one head that's directing everything, perfectly. And American foreign policy elites and military elites, they have areas of the world where they are more embedded, have greater experience, greater institutional knowledge. Places like Latin America and the Caribbean, where there's a long history of American intervention, where they might have just a better cadre of empire managers. And places like the Middle East, where they lacked, a capacity, that they ended up relying on local allies, on information given to them by pro-American, the intelligence services of countries that are allied with the United States, which pursue their own agendas and seek to kind of push the United States into, adopting a policy that's most favorable to them as well. So, the Syrian civil war is a good example of that. That the United States certainly intervened and was but it was largely reactive to a situation, and American policy in Syria, which is to a certain degree incoherent and confused, was shaped not just by foreign policy elites in DC who were coming to the Syrian question with like a very clear plan of what to do, but rather by a policy that was developed kind of on the fly with the input of Saudi Arabia, of Turkey, of, various groups with confusing, with different interests that helped provide technical expertise to the United States, that provided lists of groups of people, contacts, and those kind of things. So we have when we look at imperialism as a system, we can look at imperialism as something that one country does to another, but we can also look at it as a global system, the way that the world is organized. And American empire is not just America that participates in it. There are a lot of countries that also participate in sustaining that empire for their own interests, if that makes sense. So, for example, I'll give you a historical example. Hitler was at war with Great Britain, but one of Hitler's dreams was to make peace with Britain and maintain the British Empire. And part of the reason was because the British Empire for Hitler, had some utility. He just wanted to make sure that Germany was the top empire of the world. But the institution of empire itself for British Empire was seen as something that could remain in a Nazi-dominated world. So, imperialism is a global system that implicates a lot of different groups. If that's clear.
Go ahead, Susan.
Just to kind of take this back to I guess the human level, the individual level, what do you think is causing these anti-imperialists to come up with ideas like the enemy of my enemy is my friend? Because I've been told that by a person I assumed was serious. What is this rejection of complexity, as you see it, particularly as a British person?
I mean,
a person who's not from the United States, because I feel I have a different vantage point with my parents being from a different country as well. Go ahead.
I think it's a kind of understandable reaction to the dominant narrative of American exceptionalism, that America is trying to do good in the world, right? And I think people see through that, but they aren't fully, and in trying to, oppose empire, they think that the best way to do that is to support those, to run apologetics for those who are opposing American empire, to launder their reputations of leaders like, the leaders of the Islamic Republic or the leaders of Syria. And I think that laundering is a response to a kind of understandable fear that any concession to the truth of something that the imperialists might say is an endorsement for the exercise of American power. But my point is that we should disconnect the question of trying to assess whether a particular human rights abuse or particular justification for intervention is true or not. We should disentangle that question from the question of whether intervention should be engaged in, full stop. I think those are separate questions, and we should keep them separate, because we're basically debating on the territory. If we focus on trying to, if we premise our anti-imperialism on the idea that the imperialists are lying about the human rights abuses, the question is, well, what if they're not lying? What if these abuses are real? Does that mean then the justification is legitimate? We can debate the veracity of particular claims or not, but we should say that debate is a separate one from our dogmatic opposition to the exercise of American military power. Because even if the justification in a limited sense is true, from the historical record, America is not very good at doing humanitarian interventions. They often make things worse. That's the kind of like technocratic bull in a china shop argument. And B, the more powerful argument, I think, is that, well, whatever the case, we should oppose American empire because of the big picture questions related to to the costs of American empire, both to us in the United States and to people around the world.
Can you explain the bull in the china shop analogy one more time?
Yeah, so the bull in the china shop analogy is a kind of technocratic argument, I would say. It straddles the line between, a principled opposition to American imperialism and a kind of pragmatic opposition, because it makes the argument that, America's just bad at intervening, right? Like whatever the intentions are, it always ends up badly, right? And so, whether an intervention such as in Iraq is done outside of the UN, or whether it's in Libya where it was done with the cooperation of the UN, that's kind of like irrelevant, because the outcome is, at least in most cases, making the situation worse, or at least implicating the United States in a bloody conflict which it doesn't need to be implicated in, right? Societies may degenerate because of economic, social, political factors internal to them. And that will be tragic, and there will be a vast human cost to it. But we can make the case that the vast majority of examples of American intervention on quote unquote humanitarian grounds have done little to remedy those cases, even if we can cite a few examples of where they perhaps did save lives, and it's provable that they saved lives. So the bull in the china shop is a very powerful argument, but it always leaves you open to a special pleading, because you might say, well, this intervention is bad. In general, intervention is bad, but there's this special case where I think that it will work out because of X, Y, and Z, right? So I think, along with the bull in the china shop argument, which is just a technocratic question that says American military intervention, just whatever you think of it, whatever the moral case for it, it just never ends well. I think that's one important plank, but I think the broader one is that we should focus on opposing the military-industrial complex in this dogmatic fashion, because every time it is used, every time American military power is exercised for whatever reason, however justifiable, however morally justifiable, the long-term consequences are dire. To use an analogy, a kind of look. People have seen Lord of the Rings, right?
Sure.
You know, Frodo, he's got the ring, right? He's
Mhm.
got the ring, and they're taking the ring to Mount Doom to throw it in. Now the ring is evil, right? And every time the ring is used, you get one step closer to that evil. But you know, also Frodo uses that ring to protect himself, right? So the American military power could theoretically be used in a humanitarian way, but it's like the ring, you know, every time it's used, the Nazgul are going to come a bit closer, you know? So you know, even in a limited sense where you could make a moral case for intervention, where you know there are people screaming to be protected against the most barbaric repression out there. we should resist that kind of moral guilt that is used to reinforce the military industrial complex.
In the end, as we're coming up on the hour, what do the anti-imperialists want? What does victory look like?
Well, I think for a lot of anti-imperialists, or at least the type of anti-imperialists I'm talking about, I think there's a lot of hope in the formation of a multipolar world. You know, there's a lot of talk about multipolarity, and there's a kind of notion that multipolarity will be a positive development. Now, my argument on multipolarity is not that multipolarity is better or worse than American global dominance, right? I don't have much time for arguments that say, well, you know, America may be bad, but if some other power was the dominant power, if China was the dominant power, it would be worse. That's not what I want to say. But what I want to say is that, you know, most of the countries that people are looking to, for example, the BRICS countries, those are capitalist countries. Some of them, like India, have extremely vicious right-wing governments in charge now. So, you know, multipolarity may or may not happen in a relatively shorter or longer space of time. I think the age of American dominance, or at least the absolute dominance that the United States had, I think that is to a certain degree over. But I don't think, you know, a multipolarity will necessarily make things better for, let's say, you know, the quest for democracy or socialism around the world. Certain societies and countries may benefit from it, you know, in a competitive world. You know, if your country is like an African country, you've now got the Chinese and the Americans. You know, there's going to be advantages to that. But that's a very state-orientated perspective, right? Because within these states, there are sort of class differences. So, for example, you know, who benefits from development? Well, in all these societies, it generally is an elite. Now, so there may be positive outcomes for the masses. There may be in certain societies, but other societies may not benefit from it, right? So, you know, at the end of the day, it doesn't move us any closer to socialism per se. It just creates a new it's just a new geopolitical order of things. There may be a reordering of the winners and the losers in international society. Some groups may benefit, some groups may not benefit. But, you know, at the end of the day, it's just rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic rather than challenging the global system of capitalism that prevails at this moment of time. So I can understand the kind of desire for multipolarity in face of the brutality of American empire, but I ultimately don't see it as necessarily a positive step, and it could lead to worse situation. You know, at present, I think Ben Burgess has the good analogy where it's like, well, at the moment there's one mafia gang, but you know, if we have a multipolar world, we might just have 10 mafia gangs shooting each other up over the city, and there may be costs to that as well. There are costs to having one mafia, there are costs to having competitive mafias. We don't know, but at the end of the day, I think for us on the left, we don't need to put our hopes in multipolarity, because that's just geopolitics.
Well, let's talk about this in the champagne room as we've gone on a little long. We can continue this conversation. I do think that's kind of an interesting point that you just made about people calling themselves socialists and communists and every other ist that really loves technocratic geopolitics. Loves it. So
and loves to identify with states.
Yeah, that's my favorite. Yeah, we'll get into that in the champagne room, as I was going to say something, but I will not say it here on air. NT, do you have any closing remarks for tonight?
You were gonna curse, is what you
No, I
were
wasn't.
gonna do.
I was not
Okay,
cursed.
cool, good.
Don't curse like the Heavy D song. Dang, it's a Heavy D reference and a Fat Boys reference in one show.
Well, I think this has been a very nutritious conversation, and I greatly appreciate it and both of you.
Also, Djene Bajlan's piece, which you will see in the description of this show, also the comments in the chat. There will definitely be a link to the article in the comments for this show. I'm sure people listening to this later have something they would like to say. I'm sure they have something they want to get off their chest. I'm sure they want to say Djene is carrying water for big empire.
I thought you were gonna say Djene is cute. I read something about parasocial relationships in the chat, and I thought that's exactly what you were gonna say.
No, I actually cannot see. For the most of the show, I couldn't see the chat, and I think that's maybe a much happier person.
Yeah,
Miss O. But definitely leave a comment. Also, I have a new piece out in Sublation called "Stakes is High," Addicted to the Spectacle, which is not about this, but kind of about this as well. But this is one of the few pieces Djene didn't edit for me.
Ooh.
That's why there were so many typos in it.
Take that. If you think Djene is cute and you like his ponytail, sound off in the comments too.
Definitely, Djene, you should let the hair down and hit him with a little bit of Fabio, Kurdish Fabio.
They're not ready.
They're not
That's
ready.
what my mom calls me, Fabio. I think Sarah calls me Fabio too.
Fabio, if you don't pick up them goddamn clothes off the floor.
He's just so used to it, this guy.
Well, thank you guys very much. And we are
Fabio.